It started with a quiet movement boxes, unmarked and swiftly carried through a private Windsor corridor. No announcement, no acknowledgment. But those who saw it knew instantly something irreversible had begun. And at the center of it all was Prince Andrew, a name the palace had been trying to silence. Until now. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The first whispers did not come from headlines or official statements, but from those who walk the corridors no one else sees. Staff who noticed patterns shifting. Movements happening at hours when Windsor usually falls into stillness. It began subtly, one corridor closed without explanation, one doorway guarded more tightly than usual. Then came the instructions, quiet but firm, avoid certain areas, ask no questions, and most importantly, speak to no one. Those inside understood immediately that this was no routine adjustment. This was something deliberate, something controlled. And yet no one outside the inner circle was meant to notice. What made it more unsettling was the precision. According to insiders, items were not simply being moved, they were being documented, catalogued, and removed with a level of care that suggested finality. Not relocation, not storage, removal. Entire sections of personal belongings reportedly passed through unseen channels, carried out without labels, without identification, as if the palace itself was attempting to erase the trace of ownership. The silence surrounding it only deepened the tension. No clarification from officials. No acknowledgement from royal spokespeople. Even as the activity became impossible to ignore, the public narrative remained untouched, frozen in denial, while something far more significant unfolded behind closed doors. For those watching closely, the signs had been building for weeks. Insiders whispered that something felt off, that internal discussions had grown sharper, more urgent. There were murmurs of decisions being delayed, then suddenly accelerated. Staff rotations shifted. Access permissions changed. The atmosphere inside Windsor, usually governed by routine and tradition, became unpredictable. And still, nothing was said. The palace maintained its composure, presenting stability while quietly orchestrating a transformation that could not be undone. What made this moment different was not just the act itself, but the intention behind it. This was not damage control. This was not a temporary measure. The scale, the secrecy, the execution, it all pointed towards something far more calculated. A decision that had been weighed, resisted, and ultimately enforced. Those closest to the operation reportedly understood the gravity of what they were witnessing. This was not just about clearing space, it was about redefining it, about drawing a line that could not be crossed again. And as the last of those unmarked boxes disappeared from sight, one reality became impossible to ignore. This was not an isolated event. It was a signal. A quiet but undeniable shift in how the institution was choosing to move forward. A moment where silence spoke louder than any official statement ever could. Because what was being removed was not just physical, it was symbolic, carrying years of tension, controversy, and unresolved decisions within it. And once that process began, there was no turning back. But this wasn't just a quiet removal, it was the beginning of a calculated royal reset years in the making. Long before the boxes appeared, that Windsor wing had already become something else, a silent vault of controversy. Shadowed by decisions the palace could never fully explain. And now, it was being erased. What once represented privilege, continuity, and royal permanence had slowly transformed into something far more complicated, a space no longer defined by presence, but by absence, by the weight of what lingered behind closed doors. Within Windsor Castle, every room carries meaning. Every corridor tells a story of legacy and belonging. And to occupy a private wing is not merely about residence, it is about status, identity, and position within the very fabric of the monarchy. For years, that space had been closely tied to Prince Andrew, a symbol of his standing, his proximity to power, and his place within an institution built on hierarchy and tradition. But over time, that meaning began to shift, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until the space itself no longer reflected the certainty it once held. Insiders suggest that long before any visible movement began, the wing had entered a kind of suspended reality. Not abandoned, but not fully lived in either. Maintained, but untouched. Preserved, yet disconnected. Staff who passed through spoke in hushed tones about an atmosphere that felt different, as though time had stalled within those walls. Personal items remained in place, untouched for months, creating an eerie sense that nothing had changed, even as everything around it had. It was not neglect. It was something more deliberate. A pause. A hesitation. As if the palace itself was uncertain how to proceed, caught between preserving tradition and confronting a reality it could no longer ignore. That uncertainty did not exist in isolation. Behind the scenes, pressure was quietly building, growing stronger with each passing week. Conversations within the palace reportedly became more focused, more urgent, shifting from quiet concern to strategic necessity. The question was no longer whether change would come, but how it would be executed without fracturing the delicate balance the monarchy relies on. Maintaining space within royal grounds has always been deeply symbolic. It signals inclusion, relevance, and legitimacy. And to redefine that space is to redefine the person connected to it. That is why the decision carried such weight. It was not simply logistical. It was deeply personal, deeply institutional, and impossible to reverse once set in motion. Even before the first box was moved, subtle signs of change had already begun to appear. Staff rotations were adjusted without explanation. Access to certain corridors became restricted, not publicly, but quietly enforced through internal channels. Those who once moved freely found themselves redirected, their paths altered without discussion. It was a controlled narrowing of access, a silent restructuring that hinted at what was to come. The wing, once integrated into the daily rhythm of Windsor, became isolated, its presence acknowledged, but increasingly distant. Insiders described it as frozen in time, not just because nothing changed, but because everything around it had moved forward without it. And that is what made the eventual clearance so significant. It was not sudden. It was the culmination of months of quiet preparation, of internal conflict, of decisions delayed and then finally acted upon. The stillness of that wing had not been accidental, it had been part of a larger process, one that allowed the palace to transition from hesitation to action without drawing attention too soon. By the time the removal began, the outcome had already been decided. The space had already been redefined in principle, long before it was cleared in reality. But what forced the palace to finally act wasn't just time, it was mounting pressure that could no longer be contained. For months, the silence held. But behind those historic walls, conversations had turned sharper, colder, until one decision would shift everything. What had once been quiet hesitation began to harden into something far more decisive, as pressure gathered around King Charles III, not in a single moment, but through a steady accumulation of concerns that could no longer be ignored. Those closest to the inner workings of the palace suggest that the discussions were no longer about possibility, but about necessity. The weight of past controversies, long managed through distance and silence, had begun to press against the institution itself, threatening to reshape how the monarchy was perceived not just in private circles, but on a global stage. And in a system where perception is inseparable from survival, that pressure carried consequences far beyond any single individual. Advisors, according to those familiar with the situation, had grown increasingly direct. The language shifted. What had once been framed as caution became urgency. There were repeated calls for a clearer line, a more defined separation that would leave no ambiguity about where the monarchy stood. It was no longer enough to remain distant. Distance could be interpreted as hesitation, and hesitation as weakness. And weakness, within an institution built on centuries of authority, is something that cannot be afforded. The argument being presented behind closed doors was simple, but heavy with implication. The longer the delay, the greater the risk to the crown's long-term stability. At the same time, the outside world refused to let the matter fade. Media scrutiny, though less explosive than before, had not disappeared, it had evolved. It became quieter, more persistent, surfacing in cycles that kept the issue alive in public consciousness. Every reappearance of the narrative reopened questions the palace had hoped would settle over time. And each time, the absence of a definitive resolution only deepened the uncertainty. Insiders noted that this constant pressure from beyond the palace walls began to mirror the tension within them, creating a situation where inaction was no longer a neutral choice, but a decision in itself. Within the royal circle, the dynamic reportedly shifted as well. Senior figures, those who carry the responsibility of preserving the institution beyond any one reign, were said to be leaning toward a more decisive approach. The idea of a clean break began to take shape not as an act of rejection, but as a necessary step toward clarity. The monarchy, in their view, had reached a point where ambiguity was more damaging than action. And while such a move carried emotional weight, it also carried strategic value. It would signal control. It would signal direction. Most importantly, it would signal that the institution was capable of making difficult decisions when required. But even then, the decision did not come easily. Those inside describe a prolonged period of internal resistance, a hesitation rooted not just in politics, but in personal history, in relationships that cannot be reduced to simple calculations. That is what made the delay so significant. It was not avoidance, it was conflict. A struggle between preserving unity and protecting the institution. And for a time, that struggle kept everything suspended, much like the wing itself, caught between past and future. Yet eventually, that balance began to break. The arguments for action grew stronger, more unified, until the cost of waiting began to outweigh the cost of moving forward. Insiders suggest that by the time the final discussions took place, the outcome was already understood. The delay had served its purpose. It had allowed the palace to prepare, to align, to ensure that when the moment came, it would not be questioned or reversed. It would be executed with certainty. And when the decision finally came, it wasn't loud or public, it was precise, controlled, and deeply symbolic. No announcement. No cameras, just movement, quiet, deliberate, and executed with the kind of precision reserved for moments the palace never once seen. By the time the decision had settled into certainty, the operation itself had already begun, unfolding in the margins of the night when attention was lowest and routine could be quietly rewritten. Those familiar with the inner rhythms of Windsor Castle suggest that the timing was no coincidence. Activity intensified during low-visibility hours, when the corridors that once carried ceremony and tradition instead carried something far more controlled. It was not rushed. It was not chaotic. Every step appeared measured, calculated, as though the outcome had been mapped long before the first item was ever touched. At the center of it all were the belongings themselves, objects that once defined presence, now being stripped of that meaning piece by piece. Insiders describe a process that was neither casual nor indifferent. Each item was reportedly sorted with care, documented with quiet precision, and prepared for removal as part of a system that left nothing to chance. This was not a hurried clearing. It was a methodical dismantling, the kind that suggests not just organization, but intention. A clear understanding that what was being handled carried more than material value. It carried history, association, and identity tied closely to Prince Andrew himself. What made the operation even more controlled was the decision to limit involvement. According to those with knowledge of the process, only a small circle of trusted internal staff were permitted to take part. No external contractors, no additional oversight. The fewer the hands, the fewer the risks. This level of restriction created an environment where information could be contained, where every movement remained within a tightly managed structure. It was not simply about efficiency. It was about silence. The kind of silence that ensures the story does not escape before the palace is ready for it to be understood. Alongside this, subtle shifts in security began to emerge. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention from those not looking closely, but enough for insiders to recognize that something significant was underway. Access points quietly monitored. Movement patterns adjusted. Presence reinforced without explanation. It was a protective layer, not just around the operation itself, but around the narrative that surrounded it. Because in moments like this, controlling the action is only half the battle. Controlling the perception is what defines the outcome. Perhaps the most telling detail, however, lay in how the items were removed. Reports suggest that nothing was labeled. Nothing was marked. The belongings left the space without identifiers, stripped of any visible connection to their origin. It was a subtle but powerful choice. Without labels, there is no story attached. Without identification, there is no direct link to what once was. It transforms the act from a relocation into something far more final, a quiet severing of association that cannot be easily traced or reversed. Those who witnessed fragments of the process have described it as a complete internal reset, a phrase that carries more weight than it first appears. Because a reset does not simply remove, it redefines. It clears not just space, but meaning. It signals that what existed before is no longer aligned with what must come next. And in an institution where every decision echoes through history, such a move is never taken lightly. But what was being removed wasn't just physical, it carried a deeper meaning. The palace couldn't hide forever. Because when a royal space is cleared, it's never just about the room, it's about what and who no longer belongs there. What unfolded behind the walls of Windsor Castle was not simply a logistical decision, not just a matter of reorganizing space or redefining occupancy. It was something far more profound, far more personal. In a system where proximity to the crown defines identity, to lose that space is to lose more than access. It is to lose position, presence, and the silent acknowledgement of belonging. And for Prince Andrew, that shift carries a weight that cannot be measured in walls or rooms alone. For years, his association with that wing represented continuity, a visible reminder that regardless of public perception, his place within the royal structure remained intact, at least in form, if not in function. But now, that final link appears to have been quietly severed. Insiders suggest that this move is not symbolic in the abstract, it is symbolic in the most literal sense. It redraws the boundaries of inclusion. It sends a message that presence within royal grounds is no longer guaranteed by history alone, but by alignment with the institution's present direction. And that message, once delivered, cannot be taken back. What makes it even more striking is the quiet finality that surrounds it. There was no dramatic announcement, no moment of public reckoning, no formal declaration of change. Instead, the shift occurred in silence, unfolding in a way that allows the palace to maintain composure while still enforcing a decisive outcome. Those familiar with internal reactions describe it as something deeply understood, even without words. The absence of acknowledgment does not lessen the impact. If anything, it amplifies it. Because within the monarchy, what is left unsaid often carries more meaning than what is openly declared. There is also an emotional dimension that cannot be ignored, even if it is never publicly expressed. To be physically removed from Windsor is not simply a relocation, it is a separation from a place that represents history, connection, and identity. It is a quiet distancing that extends beyond geography into something far more personal. Insiders have described the move as final, not temporary, a phrase that lingers because of what it implies, not a pause, not a transition, but an endpoint, a closing of a chapter that had remained unresolved for far too long. And yet, within that finality lies a question that has not been answered. Where does this leave him now? Not just in terms of residence, but in terms of role, relevance, and recognition within the institution itself. The monarchy operates on visibility and structure, on clearly defined roles that signal order and continuity. When one of those roles becomes unclear, the uncertainty does not remain isolated, it begins to ripple outward, affecting how the entire system is perceived. That is why this moment feels so significant. It is not just about one individual stepping further away from the center, it is about the institution redefining who stands within it, and under what conditions. It is a recalibration of boundaries. A quiet but unmistakable shift in how inclusion is determined. And once those boundaries are redrawn, they do not easily return to what they were before. But the ripple effect didn't stop with Andrew, it began reshaping the balance inside the monarchy itself. As one chapter quietly closed, another began, and the monarchy itself started to look very different. The shift was not announced, yet its impact moved quickly through the structure of Windsor Castle, where space is never just physical, it is strategic, symbolic, and deeply tied to the future of the institution. What had been cleared did not remain empty for long in purpose, even if it appeared so in presence. Because within the palace, space is always reassigned with intent. It reflects priorities, it signals direction, and in this moment, it began to align with a vision that had been quietly forming long before the first box was ever moved. At the heart of that vision is the idea of a streamlined monarchy, a structure built not on expansion, but on focus. Fewer roles, clearer responsibilities, stronger public alignment. This is not a sudden change, but a continuation of a long-term approach associated with King Charles III, who has long been understood to favor a more contained and efficient royal presence. What makes this moment significant is not the idea itself, but its execution. For years, the concept existed as a direction. Now it is becoming reality, shaped through decisions that redefine who occupies the center and who remains at the edges. As that center becomes more defined, the prominence of Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, has grown steadily, not through sudden elevation, but through consistent positioning. Their roles are no longer framed as future responsibilities, they are present, active, and increasingly central to how the monarchy presents itself. Insiders suggest that this shift is not accidental. It is part of a broader alignment, one that ensures continuity while also reinforcing stability in a time where public trust remains essential. Their presence, their visibility, their measured approach, all of it, contributes to a narrative of reliability that the institution is now leaning into more than ever before. Behind this visible shift lies a deeper layer of internal restructuring. Not dramatic, not disruptive, but precise. Roles are being clarified. Expectations are being adjusted. The structure is tightening in ways that are not immediately obvious to those outside the palace, but are deeply felt within it. This is how transformation happens in an institution built on tradition. It does not break from its past. It reshapes it from within. And every decision, no matter how quiet, contributes to that reshaping. What ties all of this together is a broader effort toward modernization, not in the sense of abandoning tradition, but in refining how it is presented and maintained. The monarchy is not simply reacting to events, it is positioning itself for what comes next. That requires control. It requires clarity. And above all, it requires a careful balance between continuity and change. The recent developments, subtle as they may seem, are part of that balance. They reflect a deliberate effort to strengthen the institution from within while presenting a unified, stable image to the outside world. This is why the shift feels larger than the moment itself. It is not just about reassigning space or adjusting roles. It is about signaling a direction, a movement toward a structure that is more focused, more controlled, and more aligned with the expectations of a modern audience. And while the changes may unfold quietly, their implications are far-reaching, touching every layer of the monarchy's identity. And yet, even as the palace moves forward, one question lingers: why now? Because timing, in the royal world, is never accidental, and this moment feels anything but random. What unfolded within Windsor Castle did not emerge from a sudden impulse or a single decision made in isolation. It reflects something deeper, something carefully aligned with a broader pattern that insiders suggest has been developing quietly over time. In an institution where every move is weighed against history, perception, and consequence, the moment chosen for such an action carries meaning far beyond the act itself. And that is what makes this timing so compelling. It feels deliberate, calculated to coincide with a point where internal readiness and external expectation finally intersect. Speculation has grown around why this shift happened now, rather than earlier, when pressure had already begun to mount. Some suggest that the delay was strategic, allowing the palace to build a framework strong enough to support the consequences of such a move. Others believe it was tied to a gradual recalibration of public perception, a recognition that the narrative surrounding Prince Andrew had reached a stage where silence could no longer contain its impact. What remains consistent across these interpretations is the understanding that the timing was not reactive alone, it was also anticipatory, designed to shape how the story would be understood moving forward. There are also indications that this moment aligns closely with ongoing internal planning, particularly in how the monarchy presents itself in a rapidly changing public landscape. The need for clarity, for consistency, for a defined structure that reinforces trust, these are not short-term concerns. They are long-term priorities. And decisions like this do not exist outside of that context. They are part of a larger strategy, one that seeks to ensure the institution remains stable, credible, and aligned with the expectations placed upon it. In that sense, the clearance becomes more than an isolated action. It becomes a piece of a much larger design. Media insiders have pointed to what they describe as a shift in narrative control, suggesting that the palace is no longer simply responding to external pressures, but actively shaping how its story unfolds. This distinction is critical. To react is to follow. To control is to lead. And in a landscape where perception can shift rapidly, maintaining that control becomes essential. By acting at this moment, the palace appears to have positioned itself not as a subject of the narrative, but as its author. The action itself becomes the message, signaling decisiveness, direction, and authority. At the same time, the decision carries a dual nature. It is both reactive and proactive, addressing existing concerns while also setting the stage for what comes next. It acknowledges the weight of the past without being confined by it, creating space both literal and symbolic for a different future to take shape. This balance is not easy to achieve. It requires precision, timing, and a clear understanding of the stakes involved. And yet, that is exactly what this moment appears to represent. As more details surface, a growing belief is taking hold that this is not an isolated act, but a turning point. A moment where the trajectory of the monarchy subtly but unmistakably shifts. The implications extend beyond any one individual, reaching into the structure, the priorities, and the identity of the institution itself. And once such a shift begins, it rarely stops at a single action. It continues, reshaping everything that follows, which leads to the final, unavoidable truth: this wasn't just about the past. It was about the future of the crown. The boxes are gone. The rooms are empty. But what remains is something far more significant, a message that cannot be undone. Within Windsor Castle, where history is not just remembered but actively preserved, absence itself becomes a statement. The cleared wing no longer holds personal belongings, but it now carries something far heavier: a visible assertion of institutional control over personal legacy. What once represented continuity tied to Prince Andrew has been transformed into a space that reflects something entirely different: authority, direction, and the quiet but firm boundaries of an evolving monarchy. Because in a system built on symbolism, removal is never neutral. It redefines meaning. It redraws lines, and in this case, it reinforces a distinction the palace appears increasingly determined to make: a clear separation between past and present. What belonged to one era does not automatically carry into the next. What was once tolerated does not necessarily remain accepted. The act itself becomes a signal, not just to those within the institution, but to those observing from the outside. It says that the monarchy is not static. It adapts, it recalibrates, and when necessary, it makes decisions that prioritize its future over its history. That shift is now becoming visible in more ways than one. Insiders describe an environment that feels more structured, more deliberate, and in some ways, more distant. A colder, more controlled atmosphere, where decisions are executed with clarity but without sentimentality. This is not about emotion. It is about preservation, about ensuring that the institution remains intact, even if that requires difficult choices that resonate far beyond the moment they are made. The warmth of tradition remains, but it is now balanced by a sharper edge of discipline, a recognition that survival in the modern era demands more than ceremony, it demands control. Yet even within that control, the emotional and historical weight of what has been erased lingers. Spaces like this are not just physical, they are layered with memory, with identity, with years of presence that cannot simply disappear without consequence. The absence becomes its own kind of presence, a reminder of what once was and what has now been deliberately left behind. And for those who understand the deeper language of the monarchy, that absence speaks volumes. It tells a story of transition, of tension resolved not through words, but through action. At the same time, the palace continues to move forward, carrying with it the momentum of these decisions. But that movement is not without consequence. Every shift creates ripples. Every boundary redraws relationships. And while the institution may emerge more defined, more controlled, it also becomes something slightly different than it was before. That is the cost of evolution. That is the price of maintaining relevance in a world that demands clarity and accountability. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so powerful. It is not loud. It is not dramatic in the way the public might expect. But it is final. It is deliberate. And it leaves behind a message that cannot be reversed or reinterpreted. The monarchy has chosen its direction, and in doing so, it has made clear that belonging within its walls is no longer just a matter of history, it is a matter of alignment with what it now represents. Because in the end, this wasn't just about clearing a room, it was about redefining who truly belongs within the walls of Windsor. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.